Thank you so much. It's great to be here again at RCAF. A long time ago, I came to RCAF, I think when you used to have some winter meetings, because I think it was cold when I came to South Dakota. But I'm happy to be here. Man, today was really interesting. The questions were wonderful. The ideas, I learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. And it's so fun to be out here with everybody together. In fact, at my table, we were just talking about farmer packing companies and my experience working with alternative pork and alternative beef companies and some of the issues that can come up. So today I'm going to talk about corporate power. Surprise, surprise, right? But I'm going to talk about corporate power, but what it means to communities, to us as farmers, consumers, and really what's going on in the food system and what that it means for us as citizens. I was sitting at a table with some folks that are from my home state, Nebraska. I grew up south of York, Nebraska. Anybody from that area of Nebraska by chance? I can't hardly see anyway, but hopefully there's some. My brother's still farming there. Like Mike Stuma was talking about, we raised pigs, and they did put me through college. Not possible now. So today I'm going to talk about, I went too far. Today I'm going to talk about stuff beyond the markets, though. You talked a lot today about price issues. You talked about regulatory policy. You talked about monopolies and the monopolization of the market. But my big thing is, what does this mean? What does the consolidation in the food system mean for communities, for your communities, and for the natural places that you come from? And also, what does it mean for our resilience and our ability to get food in the future? And I think those are really important questions that we need to talk about. Because a lot of that boils down to who has the power to make decisions in our food system. Who has the power to decide where food is going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, what's going to be produced, who is going to produce it, and who gets to eat it. And I'm going to argue through some of the slides I'm going to show you that most of that power resides in corporate boardrooms, in corporate offices, with those people make decisions about a lot of what we put on our plate and how we grow it. Those questions are really important, though, for understanding, can we feed ourselves in the future with the way we've currently organized food production and consumption? That's a question. That's a big question. And can the way we produce and consume food reflect our responsibilities as citizens? Should it? I would argue yes. And these questions are all connected because they're all about power, the power to make decisions, and the power to shape relationships. And my argument is going to be is that we have to rethink those relationships in our food system if we are going to have a food system that works for us, our communities, and our ecologies. So really what I'm talking about tonight is feeding ourselves now and into the future, and how best we can do that. And those are big questions. And it's a big question because I argue, food is just different, right? How many of you like the steak you had tonight? Woohoo! Man, it tasted good. And it was, I'm blanking on the guy at lunch who was talking about it, those great meatballs, and then he provided that, and the steak tonight is really good, right? But you know what also made it special? Is I saw him. he was here, right? That was really cool. Because food has got a lot of stuff going on. You know, food, what happens if you don't get food for 40 days? Right? 40 days, about. That we have to have it every single day. Water, food, shelter. These are essential to humans, essential to humanity. So in that sense, food is very special. But it's also special because we have cultural traditions around it. You know, we have festivals around agriculture and food. Food has just got this unique spot in our lives. It's necessary, it's social, it's cultural. And that's why we need to be concerned about the distribution of power in our food system. And who gets to make decisions is part of that power issue. Well, we're going to have to address power relationships in the food system if we're going to ensure that humanity is fed into the future. And this is really, I mean, I'm not being hyperbolic here. It's really important. So I'm going to talk about power. And as a sociologist, we talk a lot about power. That's one of the things that we think is really important in understanding human relationships and how society acts and so on. So I'm going to talk about power relationships in food and agriculture, not that kind of AGCO tractor power. AGCO is one of only 2 companies really, right? There's about 2 or 3 companies out there that make our agricultural equipment. But I'm not going to spend that much time on it. I'm going to talk about what power means in how we make decisions in our food system. So my colleague, Harvey James, who's an agricultural economist, we've been talking about this for quite a while. But I think it's really interesting what Dr. Miller said this morning. He was talking about the formula contracts and why people would sign a formula contract. You remember what he said? He's like, because they didn't know if that price would be there in the future or if they could even get them sold without signing that contract. You know what that is? That means that consolidation in the food system has constrained your choices. It's limited your choices. And what it's done is it's restricted the choice options you can make, both on the input side and on the output side, as farmers and ranchers. It's also constrained those of us who eat. How many of those of us? All of us, right? All of us eat. It's constrained our choices as well. And sometimes these consolidated markets, I would argue that often they force people into the kinds of decisions they might not have otherwise chosen for ethical reasons, for community reasons, and so on. So these consolidated markets limit choices. That's really important because that means that people are not getting to make the choices that they might want to make. So I'm going to talk right now, and don't worry about reading this. I'll tell you what it is. I'm going to talk about stuff you already know, right? You know it because you live it, but this is just documenting it a little bit more. So this chart was actually created by my colleague, Philip Howard. He's at Michigan State University. And we write a lot together. We wrote a paper in 2020 for Family Farm Action Alliance documenting current consolidation issues. But Phil writes on the seed industry structure a lot. What you need to know about this is that these red things, these are agrochemical companies, but they're the ones that bought all of these other little blue things, which in 1996 were seed companies, right? So you can see that these were all bought here, and then that was acquired here, and that was acquired here, right? So we know that this consolidation issue, it was really a big flurry in the seed industry. And I think Eric Nelson referenced that earlier today. But that was a big flurry of things that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, with Roundup Ready soybeans and the flurry of the convergence, as we might say, of agrochemicals and seeds. But essentially what this means is that these big red dots, that's Bayer there, Corteva down there. These big red dots are, in the last, we saw that flurry in the early 2000s, and then we saw another flurry in the last 5 years. Essentially, the concentration ratio of the top 4 for global proprietary seeds in 2018, proprietary, was 52%. Global market share of the top 4. Now, as a sociologist, I'm concerned what happens when there's 4 or fewer players in a market with 40% or more is dominated by those players, that starts to get to act quite a bit like a monopoly, right? And it means that there's a lot of people that don't have choices in those markets. So it is true that farmers in Brazil face the same choices as farmers here in the United States, right? These are global companies. You look at this in agrochemical sales, you see the entrance of Chinese firms like ChemChina. And way back when ChemChina has Syngenta. Of course, Syngenta was Novartis, for those of you old enough to remember that. And some of you are older than me and can remember even before it was Novartis, right? So we've seen a lot of consolidation go on. But the point of this is that globally in agricultural chemicals, you see the top 4 in 2018 was around 65%. And I think that was before the big acquisition that ChemChina did with Sinochem in 2021. It's not just seeds, it's not just cattle, right? Animal pharmaceuticals, of course, none of you have experienced any problems with that, right? But also farm equipment, synthetic fertilizer. Do you know what's going on? How many of you have heard complaints about the fertilizer market this year? A few people? So I've been out interviewing organic farmers in Missouri. And you know what they're ticked off about? Chicken litter. Because what happened with the global synthetic fertilizer? It went up in price. And so now everybody wants their chicken litter that they've been using, right? And so their price and availability of chicken litter went up. So we see that now Phil has this down here as 33%. Fertilizer gets complicated because potash is different, than nitrogen stuff, but still, it's pretty consolidated. You guys know about beef processing. Don't tell me that it says 73% there, because Phil took numbers at first from Tyson. And guess what Tyson does with that? The only thing I can think of is that Tyson, because Tyson says what the processing is, that they lay out the top 4 stats. The only thing I can figure out is that they have cow slaughter in there, right? Am I right? So this is really, this of course is 85% according to Packers and Stockyards, but you can see that, all of these, everything, pork, chicken, processing, all of this is very consolidated, not new story, right? But it's also consolidated at the grocery level, right? So all those processed foods that the nutritionists are telling us don't eat, those are also very consolidated, right? So what gets in the grocery store, by the way? People who have the power to move stuff into the grocery store. Traders, processors of grains. This has been a long history of consolidation, but we're seeing some new players like this COFCO coming in, which is a very large Chinese firm that has, some argue that it's become number 2. I've seen some conflicting stories about that. But you've seen like a little bit, Cargill is still there, obviously, but you've seen a little bit of a decrease with like Bunge and Louis Dreyfus is the latest stuff I've heard. Now, this is interesting. This is my colleague Phil again. If you want to look at some of his stuff, philhoward.net. Go there and be more depressed if you want to. But it's good information. We need to know, right? So Phil has really good information there. But this he put together to argue about resilience, actually, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But so this takes a minute to look at, but essentially he looks at North America, South America, Europe, and these are Nestle's headquartered in Europe, okay? Tyson's headquartered in North America. So it's not percentage of North America, it's where they're headquartered. But also, you can see how big the firm is based on how big it looks here. So Nestle's a huge global food and drink firm, right? And it's primarily, a lot of it's in dairy and other processed food. Tyson is primarily in meat. There's some seafood firms in there and so on. They argue, and then, there's things like in Asia, like CP Foods, that's a Thai conglomerate that is one of the largest seafood producers in the world. But they argue that there's been a convergence of consolidated firms. The fact that we can show in one graph, complicated as it may be, global protein complex should be pretty frightening. Should be pretty frightening, right? Because that means there's not a lot of redundancy in here. There's not a lot of independent innovation going on in here. And this is looking at it at the global level. Now, that paper is freely available if you're interested in pursuing it. This stuff you know. But what does the consolidation look like out in the community? So we'll come back to my pigs. So in 1987, I was driving a stock trailer and backing it up, and I was very proud of myself, full of 23 fat hogs over to Farmland Foods in Crete, Nebraska. I told you it put me through college, right? 23 fat hogs. Can you sell 23 fat hogs anywhere to any pork place today? Good luck, right? Even if you're going to go on the all-natural route or something. But in 1987, my family was producing about 2,500 pigs a year to sell, and that was better than the median. We were in the top 50% of producers then, when there were almost 250,000 pig producers out there. Now we have maybe 50,000. How many of those might be 4-H and FFA projects? A lot, right? We don't know because it's difficult out of the ag census, but still. And now in 1987, when the hog removals were 1,200, in 2017 it was 51,000 hogs sold a year for the median. Think about that. Think about that. So the same thing has been going on in dairy, and we'll talk about that. Egg layers, not quite so many farm changes here in egg layers and broilers, but still significant expansion in the median. The median has risen. That means that 50% of the farms are producing more than that, right? What does that look like in your community? What does that look like in your community? The saddest thing I ever heard a farmer tell me back in about 2000, Northeast Missouri farmer, he says, he was about 40 years old and realized, wow, I always thought I could get big enough to survive. I'm not so sure anymore. He told me, he said, I used to look around, Mary, look and say, that farmer is getting ready to retire. I'm going to go get his farm. Or I'm going to, maybe they'll go out of business. I'll get his farm. He said, I was always thinking, but now I have no neighbors. Now I have no neighbors. Now that is a community issue. That is a community issue in all of the communities you all come from, and in the community where I grew up in Shickley, Nebraska, 45 miles south of York. What does it look like when I go back there and everybody's hair is my color or grayer? Now, this is an issue. So if you look at don't look too closely at the cattle feeding. Most of this the data came from Jim McDonald, who I think does great work, very good work. But we both agree that cattle feeding numbers in the U.S. Ag Census are not that great, okay? Let me just say. So don't get me on the cattle feeding numbers here. You know, you can see the same kind of thing going on across the board in commodity production. And this just puts it out there. You know, now the broiler annual sales removals is almost 750,000 birds per farm, right? Look at what happened with dairy. And I know there's former dairy producers here in the audience. But in 1987, your herd size was 80, and now it's 1,300. So that means that those structural changes in agriculture had a community impact, right? And the same thing is happening in crop farming. The share of acres and farms larger than 2,000 acres is more than doubled in 40 years. And where does it come from? It comes from those farms that are between 100 and 1,000 acres, i.e. it comes from the 500 to 1,000 acre crop farmers in the heart of the Midwest, right? That's where it came. So the farmers are farming more and more land, right? So you shifted management to these. So that means bigger equipment, means perhaps that there's fewer insurance agents, that there are fewer seed salesmen, and so on to service these folks. Now, this is a common thread across the food industry. It's not just for farmers, right? So if you start to look at retail grocery stores, you know, we don't know what's going to happen when Amazon delivers your groceries to your door, but you know, 45% by around 2018, 2019, the top 4. But we know what Walmart does. Walmart's is the biggest grocer. We know what it does when it comes to little towns, right? So, yeah, can you go to, you know, back in my hometown of Shickley, Nebraska, there is a grocery store yet. I don't know how, but there is. But, you know, who's going to supply them? Because Walmart, you know, when Walmart entered the grocery business, they built their own supply chains. So you don't have those distributors anymore. These are community impacts I'm talking about. Not just impacts on you and your farm, but what does it mean for your neighbors, for elderly people in the community? All of these things are really important. And then you think about across the board as a consumer, we think, oh, wow, we go to this big grocery store, we have all this choice. But in reality, it's owned by just a few firms, right? Now this data is my friend up in he passed in the last year, but he put this data together. Not all of those brands are going to go to those companies right now because it's very dynamic in the branding arena, but still 10 companies, and we're talking global companies. And then you think, oh, well, let's do alternatives, right? And this is the organic arena. So what happens when we try alternatives? And people develop alternative production and get consumers interested in it. What happens? And we can see what happens, right? This is the consolidation in the organic industry, an industry that is still growing at a really rapid rate, but has had growth levels of 20% a year, which, by the way, you can't achieve those growth levels in regular food. People are switching out, right? So people, you know, who did the innovation? Who did all the innovation, right? And now it's very consolidated. So the other thing I want to talk about besides the community impacts of this is I want to talk about how it's all interconnected. So look at what happened in COVID. In COVID, Black Swan event, how many of you think something like COVID could happen again? Yeah, most of you, right? So we had all these Black Swan events. I keep hearing Black Swan events, right? The Holcomb fire, COVID, right? The avian flu, all these things. But man, that's 2019, 2020, and 2022, right? But these are interconnected. So we have working conditions in the meatpacking plants. They're loud. There's temperature changes. It's hard physical work, and you have a respiratory virus come through. And nobody's prepared for it. Nobody's prepared for it, so everybody's getting sick in these plants. So what does that do when they got sick in the plants and on the other side of the state, where they had to shut down the pork processing plant that had 4 or 5% of the kill the daily kill. They shut down that plant in Sioux Falls. Is it Sioux Falls, South Dakota? I always get Sioux City, Iowa, and Sioux Falls, sorry. But in Sioux Falls, when they had to shut that down. So then, you heard from Eric Nelson today. I almost took this out because I could not document what I had thought about the euthanized animals, and then Eric brought it up. So I'm going to talk about it because I can't imagine what it was like for those farmers. Those farmers who had raised pigs, and you can quibble about the production processes and so on, but none of us wants to walk out there and kill a whole barn of pigs. I mean, my goodness, nobody wants to do that. Psychologically, that is difficult, almost impossible, and they had to do it because it was just in time. There was no redundancy in the system to allow those folks any leeway on their pigs. So the worker issue is connected with the farmer issue. And then, by the way, look at this data out of Iowa. Notice I pick on every state except Missouri. We have our own problems in Missouri too, but look at this data out of Iowa. The total phosphorus export from Iowa agricultural watersheds, Iowa contributes 15% of phosphorus load to Gulf of Mexico. Now, a lot of that comes from raising corn in Iowa, right? A lot of that comes from raising corn in Iowa, and it's going down the waterways, and that's just phosphorus, and that's not talking about nitrogen. Well, what is that corn used for? Hogs, 40%, right? Or some of you are probably taking it and feeding it to your cattle, but you see where I'm going? This is all interconnected. This is all social and ecological impacts of agricultural consolidation. Now, would we eliminate all of these problems if we had small independent farming again? Maybe not. You know, I grew up on a farm that wasn't always respectful of chemical use, right? So it could be that we wouldn't eliminate all of them, but we could probably have some chance of rethinking things. And so that's what I want to talk about now, is that we have to think about this differently. And I think our future is going to be decentralized and resilient. And to cut to the chase, we're going to have to do everything in our power to make it decentralized and resilient. And that means every policy that you guys are talking about, everything that Andy Green's trying to do at USDA, and it means every choice that consumers make at the grocery store, and it means every alternative production practice we can think of. It means we're going to have to do all of these kinds of things because it's going to be really important. Because the core function of a food system is to feed people now and into the future. Baltimore was one of the few cities prior to COVID that had a resilience report, and they had to call off some of their resilience stuff because the city agencies were too siloed to even address some of this, and people weren't thinking about food issues. Like, who would have thought that there wouldn't be food all the time in the grocery store? And then you have a pandemic, and it's like, oh, yeah, there's some problems here. So we really need to think about, for whom is the food system resilient? Because and by the way, I was in Iceland during the first part of COVID, and we never had problems in Iceland. And it's an island nation. We never had problems getting food there. Not to the same extent that happened here in the United States. But there's always a question of, For whom is the food system resilient? That's a big thing. No one size fits all, but we better be thinking about some principles. First of all, we got to think about adapting to thrive. So there's got to be some latitude to accommodate change. We are going to have to think about adapting our systems. They're not working that well. For farmers, for communities, for ecologies, we got to adapt them. So, that means rethinking. Maybe we shouldn't be processing 5% of our pigs all in one place, right? It means rethinking things. Redundancy of role and functions. We have to have decentralized systems that have overlapping backups in place. And by the way, we better prioritize that in policy because the market by itself, with the key players right now, are not going to think about it. But we've seen this with the supply chains issues that we have problems with between, in the medical arena, like Michael Stumo was talking about. This is food. This is food. It's a national security issue in that sense, right? So we're going to have to think about these community and regional food systems. And by the way, they did really well during COVID. They were there and they provided food all the time. They did well. Can they do it for everybody? Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't support those kinds of systems and help them grow and help them intersect with a more globalized system that is also thinking about supporting community and regional food systems. And then we're going to have a diversity of organizational forms. What does that mean? It means that we should be thinking about cooperatives that are truly democratically controlled. But we should also be thinking about private firms, right? It means that we should be thinking about small and large at the same time. I told you there's not one approach. But what we know is that diversity works. Diversity of form, diversity of organizations, large ranches, small ranches, but we need that diversity in there. And then we're going to have to, like I said, take these multiple approaches. And this is really, decentralization means democratization, right? If we think about democratizing the food system, what do I mean by that? I mean that we get to make our choices about our food. We get to make our choices about what food is produced, where, how, by whom, who gets to eat it ourselves in our communities. And what's going to work for us in our communities is really important. That's what we mean by democracy. And you can't have that kind of decentralized democracy if you don't have economic democracy as well, right? That is very important. And so it's going to take a lot of work together to fashion these alternatives, these policies that both curb monopolistic tendencies, but also prioritize new ways, new production consumption relationships. So we're going to have to encourage those development. It's not either or, and it's not big versus small per se. It's about distributing power to make decisions. So in a sense, scale doesn't really matter so much. It's what the accumulated power means. And if you can curb that power and democratize it, then large is fine. Large is not a problem. And this is some work that, and I need to wrap up, but I'm just gonna say that there's a group called Agriculture in the Middle that does some work looking at values-based value chains where the risks and rewards are shared across the value chain. But that requires trust and transparency and participation. And that's hard to achieve in a monopolized system where I don't think there's very much trust, right, between the packers and a lot of the farmers, right? So that's something to think about. And then finally, I want to end this with a sociologist account. So we often talk about how many dollars are coming into a community. If you talk to rural development professionals, they're all about, we got this big plan, it's going to have this much money and all of this. Everything is always measured in how much money you have. Except, why do you like your community? Why do you like your own community? What? It's home. What else do you like about your community? What? The people. The people. We need to totally rethink how development happens in this country, and we've got to think about comprehensive wealth. And comprehensive wealth does not prioritize financial wealth only. It's important, but it's not the priority. But neighbor relationships, trust, natural capital. Do some of you like to hunt and fish where you're at? Some of you like to walk down those country lanes? That's really important. And a lot of what we do in the industrial food system degrades that trust, degrades some of our opportunities to enjoy our places. And we can't let that happen. We have to think about investing in all of these capitals. I'm going to stop there because I really think it's hopeful. There are ways forward, but we have to understand what consolidation means beyond a price, beyond what it means on your farm, but what it means for our communities and our natural places. And I think I've got 15 minutes for questions and comments. And you can tell me if you don't agree with me or if you got questions, let me know. I think we have microphones. And like Dr. Miller said, I cannot see out there. Any questions or comments or?
Oh, hold on just a second. Let's get a mic to you, please.
I got him, George. Beat him. I beat him.
Dang, you beat me.
Sorry, I'll speak more placidly. Is there anything you learned in your time in Iceland that you think speaks to what you talked to tonight in terms of what they're doing to be resilient there that isn't being done here or in other Western nations?
Well, I think that, so they do some things really well, and they are a little haphazard about some other things. But one of the things that they really do well is that they have an idea that it'll all work out, but they prepare for it. So they have a saying, I can't say it quite right, but it's all going to work out in the end. Because we could have a volcano, we could have a big storm, we could get cut off from everything. It'll all work out, but they also prepare, right? And so they have a lot of community trainings, a lot of community trust built up to be there for if a disaster strikes. But they're also very resilient because they're really remote. Most of the population lives in the capital region. About two-thirds of the population lives in the capital region. Well, it's 8 hours to the other side of the island and so on some treacherous roads. So they're always, they're thinking about all these different kinds of things that they can do. They use geothermal energy a lot, so they are producing a lot of vegetables, surprisingly, in Iceland. But they have geothermal in their greenhouses, and I think it's just the fact that they're always innovating and always trying to think ahead to be prepared. And I think that's something, we shouldn't be surprised about black swan events, so I think that's something that we can learn from Iceland. We get a little bit too complacent, right? Relying on our bounty and so on, and we don't think about some of these things that could happen. And any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I've got one. What's your definition of comprehensive wealth?
Okay, good. So comprehensive wealth means that we talk about we value the resources, the soil, the water, what makes a place beautiful. You're from Arkansas, right?
I am.
Right. So from Arkansas, what brings the beauty to the place, the trees, whatever. That's natural capital. So we would have a way of valuing that so that if we cut down those trees or we destroy that soil for some financial capital over here, that actually decreases our comprehensive wealth. Does that make sense? So we think about what the built capital, like the roads, but also it could be a public market space, something like that allows other things to flourish. That's part of comprehensive wealth. Now, you take that to the banker, and what do they say? They're like, where's your cash flow? Right? And that's all in dollars, right? But comprehensive wealth so maybe we can't do it with the bank, but we can definitely do it with rural foundations, with any kind of development work that goes on. Like, I'm living in Boone County, Missouri, and they want to build more houses out on the east side of the county. And it's like, well, that's really the only good soil we still have left in the county. Like, we should protect it because the house will be there 20, 30 years, 40 years maybe. And a soil takes a long time. So if we thought about what are the whole wealth generating things, the natural capital, social capital. I come from a community that I grew up in Nebraska. People get things done because there's a lot of trust and reciprocity. So what did they do? They established a community foundation that invests back in the community. And one of the things that they did was invest in a cradle to graduation education kind of program. So there's daycare for people that might be working on jobs or need stuff. That was an investment that was mobilized because people had social ties and social capital. Yes, it was translated into financial capital, but it resulted from those social ties. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I was curious because to be honest, I mean, I'm kind of redneck, but it sounds a little bit like socialism to me and communism. But that was my question, is trying to decide whether, where you were going. The other question is, there was a slide that had appropriate margins. I don't recall which slide it was, but it had appropriate margins on it. So, like, are you saying that, farmers are making not enough money, they're making too much, corporations are making too much money, other people aren't making enough money? I was just curious as to your thought process there.
I'm trying to think about which slide that had on
It
there.
was 2 or 3 slides before the end, I think.
Yeah. So, I think that the right to profit is really important, right? But
Yeah, that's how you keep the doors open.
Right. But then the right to really extract enormous profits, is that a right? I mean, so in other
We're
words,
a country based on capitalism.
well, at the expense of all of these other things is what I'm trying to say. So everybody has the right to profit, but not if it comes at the expense. I'm trying to figure out how I can say this. Not if it comes at the expense of, or that profit comes from exploiting power, right? So when I say appropriate, is it, are these kinds of reasonable profits? Are these, if you think about the Packer graphs we saw this morning, are those reasonable? Or are they, is it just because they can? And is that the kind of thing, is that the kind of economy we want? I think we all want to be able to profit under capitalism, but you don't want to be that power to exploit the profits at the expense of everything and everybody else.
Well, if you convince the Packers of that, maybe we'd be better off as cattle producers.
Well, and actually, this is the issue. Like, the Packers say, oh, but our shareholders want make us do it, right? Or the retailers make us do it. Every company is going to say that because they're scared to death of negative publicity about the return on investment. Well, who's driving some of that is shareholders, and who are the shareholders? You know, there's still a fairly, I shouldn't say this because I don't know the data for sure, but there's quite a few people that are invested in have their retirements invested in the markets, and that those shareholders are the ones saying that you have to, you know, exploit nature and other people in order to keep the returns up. So, you know, it's a pretty complicated situation. And I can't say, oh, we just, you know, we need a policy that says here's what a fair margin is or an equitable margin is or something like that. It's very complicated. All I'm trying to say tonight is we need to adjust our thinking a little bit and think about the community and the ecological aspects of this, as well as the farmer and worker aspects of it.
I have a question. You know, human capital and health is your wealth.
Yeah.
You're not talking about that. And also we have an issue with industrialized agriculture compared to health. And to me, local food and meat is local sovereignty for food and health.
Well, I couldn't have said it better.
Yeah,
You did a good job. And that's really, I think that's really important. I didn't go into all of those capitals, but, you know, for the economists, the problem is measuring that. You know, how do you know what degrades our health? I mean, we don't have long-term studies on it, for instance.
You need nutritionists and other farmers involved in this decision.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, definitely.
And it needs to be focused locally or regionally.
Yep.
I promote local meat, but I also promote regionally because you can purchase and people are into convenience.
Yep.
So that has to be added in. So.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, and I didn't maybe spend as much time on that last slide as I should have. It was complicated, but I don't disagree.
No, I just wanted to make one comment to, you know, just kind of talk a little bit about when we were talking about the argument that we had there, and I guess
wasn't an argument.
Well, no, I would actually argue that the extortion and abuse of power economically on the producer, wouldn't we say that is tyranny in some sense on our producers here? You know, when these corporations promote, you know, a amount of control and an abuse of power to manipulate our markets as cattle producers, I don't know any other word to describe it than tyranny, you know?
Well, that's where I think we have to democratize the food system again, so that we're talking about decisions being made by the farmers, workers, eaters that are involved, right? And not just by shareholders and so on. I think that's really important.
We've got time for one more, I'm told, if anybody has one. And here he is.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for this tremendous presentation, because I think it really lays out the details that we need to understand why it's so important to have family farms, and a lot of them. And it brings up one of the programs that I'm with the Schiller Institute, my family farms in Iowa, and one of the things I've been working on is a program to establish 1 million new family farms, because we got to have a goal of what we're going to replace this current monopolized system with.
Yep.
And I feel like today the various presentations have showed us a really good example of what we fought a revolution not to have and what we fought a revolution to have. And your presentation really pulled a lot of details together to help make that understandable. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the comment. And I also think that those 1 million new farms, you know, when I'm talking to young farmers, they're worried about the capital required, right? They're worried about the capital required for equipment, for land, for all of these kinds of things. But if we get them into markets that don't work, that's a problem. So we have to have you know, this is a multifaceted approach. So we got to build in, and we've got to, you know, redistribute the power right now that's there to, you know, that will undercut any alternative or any of these new farmers. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.